Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. My name is John Halpin. I'm a senior fellow here at the Center, and I'm going to be moderating today's discussion about the future of progressivism, and more specifically about a new edited volume called In Search of Progressive America. Michael will have to hold this up. The panelists here will be signing books, and you can purchase those outside after the panel as well. Just a little caveat up front, we're not here to preview anything about the incoming Obama administration. We do have some nice sandwiches and drinks out there, so please help yourself. But if you're looking for other information, that's not why we're here. We only have about an hour today, so I'm going to keep it short. But let me first introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to provide a little bit of context, and then Michael's going to lead us through some discussion here. First, to my right is Michael Kazin. He's the co-editor of In Search of Progressive America, an esteemed historian, American historian, professor of history at Georgetown, author of a book that I loved and used quite frequently in the past year about William Jennings Bryan called A Godly Hero. He's written numerous other books that are phenomenal, including The Populist Persuasion. I highly suggest all of Michael's books. He's currently working on a big history about the American left. Next, we have Ezra Klein, who's an associate editor at the American Prospect. Fantastic journal. I probably don't need to say much about it. I'm sure a lot of people here read it on a regular basis. If not, you should. He's a star policy and healthcare blogger as well on TAP's website and does numerous journalistic ventures on a freelance basis and has been in the LA Times, The Guardian, The Washington Monthly, The New Republic, and numerous other magazines and media outlets. And finally, last but not least, we have Karen Kornbluh. Karen was the former policy director for Senator Barack Obama and was the primary drafter of the 2008 Democratic Party platform. She's a former deputy chief of staff at Treasury and an expert on communications policy, international trade, and issues affecting working families. First of all, let me just say to everyone, I really enjoyed reading all of your chapters in the book, and so thank you for coming today, and thanks to everyone here. Let me just quickly provide a bit of context to set the stage for our discussion. And we were talking about this last week. Looking back in history, there are three big elections, the elections in 1912, 1932, and 1964, where important progressive eras were ushered in. Two of these eras, under Wilson and under LBJ, produced major progressive changes in domestic policy, but fell off somewhat in other areas. Wilson, obviously, under the New Freedom banner, had tariff reforms and banking and antitrust reform with the creation of the Federal Reserve and the Federal Trade Commission, presided over numerous constitutional changes on taxation and women's suffrage. LBJ, of course, had the Great Society, the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, the war on poverty, and the great civil rights victories of the 60s. But both of these presidents also ended their terms on somewhat sour notes with problematic wars that had a lot of problems on the domestic front, political setbacks, progressive retrenchment, and eventually the ascendancy of a new conservative era. Only in 1932, with FDR, did you see significant progressive legislative and political successes on the domestic and international front that were both long-lasting and I think having an enduring historical legacy. And as Michael argues in the introduction to his book, this was precisely because FDR accomplished two critical goals. One, he was able to define a concise and commonly understood program embodied in the New Deal and later in the Four Freedoms on the global front. And second, he was able to use this program to build a broad and stable coalition for ongoing achievements. Obviously, this is a task that's near and dear to many progressives today. So as we turn into 2009 and beyond, I would like our panelists and the audience members in general to keep in mind a few questions. And again, we're trying to step back a little bit from the rough and tumble of legislative battles and politics to think more about the historical context. First, how does the 2008 election and what we expect to come out of it compare to other historical eras? We have a number of magazines with a picture of Obama and the famous cigarette holder looking like FDR. Is the FDR and the New Deal the correct model? Is this something that we can learn from here in terms of goals and public desires? Or are there other eras that are worth considering? Looking ahead, this is the second question. When we look ahead 4 to 8 years from now, what would significant progressive change actually look like? What are some of the benchmarks that, as a movement, as an ideological movement, that progressives are going to look for 4 to 8 years from now? What will it take to make this real? Third, what are the major obstacles to this progressive change in each of the three eras after the three elections I outlined? There were serious obstacles to accomplishing the things that progressives want. What are those types of obstacles today we want to explore? And finally, in each of the three eras I talked about, there was also notable, significant rise of ideological movements on both the left and the right. And I think it's, we'll probably end up talking a little more about the rise of potential rise of any outside ideological pressure from the left. I think that's an interesting thing to discuss. And if so, what will be the point of view of this? What will be the cleavages and issue distinctions? So with that, let me turn it over to Michael, who's going to discuss the broad historical context, and then Ezra's going to walk us through some of the larger ideological landscape of the country and talk about the differences between incremental and transformative change. And Karen is going to discuss broadly domestic policy and the potential for a new social compact. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thank you, John, and thanks everybody for coming out on the coldest day of the year, so far anyway. John's given us a dauntingly ambitious agenda for our 3-hour seminar here, and I wish we had more time. But before I dive in and make a few comments, I did want to mention a couple things about the book itself. First of all, it came about as sort of the shining example, I would say, of transatlantic cooperation. The idea for this book actually was not mine or any of the American contributors. It came from friends in the Dutch Labour Party, which is the second largest party in the Netherlands. They have a yearbook they come out with every year, and they just decided, because the election was in 2008, in this country, and the United States has a certain importance in the world, that they wanted to do it about progressive America. And so the essays here some of them were originally written for that Dutch yearbook, originally published in Dutch, and then, of course, originally written in English and translated to Dutch. And I think one of the things this taught me is that there really should be much more explicit relationships between progressives in this country and progressives in other advanced industrial nations. Even if in other countries they're called Labour Party or Social Democratic Party or even horror of horrors, socialist parties, our politics and their politics are not all that different on a lot of different issues, though, of course, the context historically and politically in our nations might be different. So I've learned a lot from conversations over the years with these friends in the Dutch Labour Party, and the book is sort of an example of that kind of partnership. Also, I just wanted to mention quickly some of the other essays in the book for those of you who haven't looked at it yet, because we really tried as much as possible, in collaboration with the Dutch editors of their yearbook, to cover a lot of topics, though clearly not all of them. It's a fairly short book. We have 2 great essays on international affairs, one by Andy Basevich, who some of you know as, you might say, progressive conservative or conservative progressive, former military officer. Another by CAP's own Matt Iglesias. We have an article on the media by Todd Gitlin, a renowned scholar of the media and politics. Another one on think tanks, both left and right, by Andrew Rich. One by Dean Baker on the welfare state and economics. And one on labor by Nelson Lichtenstein. And I have a short piece in here about religion and progressivism. Now, the premise of the book, in many ways, is what we saw when we wrote the articles originally, a year ago, 9 months ago or so, the paradox between the, I think, pretty clear fact that most Americans, judging from public opinion polls and judging from the results of the last 2 elections, agree with progressives on a whole range of issues, ranging from economic issues, social welfare issues, foreign affairs, even cultural issues like gun control and sex education. As the journalist historian Rick Perlstein, who's got a nice knack for coining phrases, put it, you suspected it all along. Now it might be true. Most Americans think like you. But the problem is, as John implied, is that we don't yet, as progressives, I think, have a forceful, easily comprehensible program or a durable coalition for progressive change. As John said, there were 3 eras, or perhaps partial eras, of progressive change in the 20th century. The so-called New Freedom, New Deal, and then New Frontier and Great Society. And as he also mentioned, the first two, well, the first and third, the new Wilson's New Freedom and then the Great Society, were, I think, better described as moments rather than eras. They didn't last that long. Progressives really had large majorities in Congress and, of course, the presidency for a fairly short period of time, basically 1913, 1917, and then 1961, 62 till 1966 midterm election. The New Deal lasted longer. There was a New Deal era, which lasted at least into the late 1940s, some would argue all the way into the 1950s. The question, of course, is can Obama preside over a fourth? On the one hand, a majority of the public is certainly ready for big changes, and for now trusts Obama to carry them out in health care and infrastructure spending, tax increases for the wealthy, aggressive steps to reverse global warming, and so forth. But one of the things that I think so far progressives lack, though CAP is one exception to this, is the kind of movement from below, progressive movement from below, which really was essential in propelling the rather cautious politics of Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors in the early 30s into what we now think of as the sort of shining moments of progressive change in the 20th century. In the 30s, of course, you had the labor movement, which was a major social movement, both the industrial labor movement, the CIO, and the craft unions, the American Federation of Labor. You had small farmers in the National Farmers Union and groups like that. You had an old age movement, which was demanding, millions of older people demanding some sort of pensions, which of course end up with being Social Security. And of course you had a fairly large group of Marxists, both socialists and communists, who were willing, most of them, not to push for revolution, but to be dedicated organizers in reformist movements. And by the late 1930s, most communists were actually supporting FDR electorally. The question is there such a movement now which can help to push the new administration to the left and which can turn what is clearly a progressive moment into a large progressive era, which can really carry out lasting changes in American politics, both ideologically, electorally, and in terms of legislation. Well, I think there's the beginning of such a movement, but it's not one that looks like the earlier movements. Historians always know that history does not repeat itself, except in metaphor and irony. The movement that helped to elect Obama, I think, is something that's fairly rare in the history of social movements in the United States. That is, it's not a progressive insurgency in the sense of sort of being more or less outside constellations of power. It's, I think, a liberal insurgency, even though liberal continues to be a dirty word for most people in politics. That is, it's a movement which is inspired by the traditional ideals of the left, equality, fraternity, sorority, and freedom, but is able and even eager to work within the exigencies of conventional party politics. As with any mass movement, this one did not emerge from a historical vacuum. Besides the obvious precursor of the Black Freedom Movement, the Obama campaign benefited from a decade of work by grassroots liberals, most from professional, educated backgrounds, who were determined to pose an alternative to the reign of conservatism in American politics. The new liberal movement began, as most of you know, with the outrage against the impeachment of Bill Clinton in the late 90s. It gathered force after the infuriating conclusion of the 2000 election. By 2008, the twin debacles of the Iraq War and the failure to save New Orleans guaranteed, I think, that millions of Americans were eager to take part in dismantling the right's hold over American politics. Obama understood this, and he infused his campaign with rhetoric infused with a longing for a new kind of insurgency from the bottom up, to convert disgust into activism. As one clever blogger said after the election, referencing the rhetoric at the Republican convention, well, now you know what a community organizer does. But this liberal movement, I think, is still in embryo, and it's also hampered by the fact that it's still mostly staffed by people like those of us up here. That is, people who are well educated, come from middle to upper middle class backgrounds, people who are, you know, in some ways born to love politics and to want to, you know, dedicate large parts of their lives to doing something about it. Not the kind of people who community organizers organize, but the kind of people community organizers are. It's a key difference. Now, as a voting bloc, we do have, and saw this in 2006, and we saw this even more in 2008, the beginnings of a progressive coalition between the members of the educated professional classes and African American, Latino, Asian American people from different social classes, but especially from working classes. And this is a coalition that, as many of you know, was sort of presaged, predicted by John Judas and Rui Teixeira in their book, The Emerging Democratic Majority, which came out in 2002. But there's still an open question about whether the liberal movement will grow larger, whether it will become the kind of cross-class, even interracial movement in a real sense, in a true sense, that did take place in the 1930s and did take place to a degree in the 1960s, even though that movement was in many ways a fragmented one between African Americans on one side, working class people for the most part, and well-educated New Left, mostly white students on the other. A true movement is not organized from the top down, so there's been a lot of talk, I know, in the Obama campaign or the post campaign about keeping the grassroots organized, holding house meetings, getting input about health care. The Secretary Designate of HHS, Tom Daschle, has asked for input from people about what we should do about health care legislation. But it's not clear that this is going to happen. And there's barriers to it happening, which we can talk about in the question period. But finally, whether or not this progressive moment is turned into a progressive era, I think depends as much on the opposition to it as it does on what progressives themselves do. And there's historical parallels for that as well, which I won't go into right now. Politically, I think there's a sort of split between how the opposition, that is conservative Republicans, are politically and how they are ideologically. Politically, I think they're not in such terrible shape. They control governorships in 3 of the 4 big states and lots of smaller ones. They have a good chance of picking up seats in the House in 2010, as usually the Out Party does in the first midterm election after a change of power, especially because soon-to-be President Obama will not be on the ballot. But ideologically, I think they are in more serious trouble. They have a dilemma that was similar to the dilemma faced by Herbert Hoover and his fellow Republicans after they lost power in 1932. That is, their biggest issues are no longer popular among the American people. Opposition to big government, defense of traditional moral values, an aggressive stance towards evil regimes. All of them have lost their popularity and their salience, I think, in political debate. So what are they going to do? If they decide to return to first principles, as many conservatives talk about, then they'll probably find themselves talking mostly to the already convinced, most of whom are white Christians who are a declining part of the population demographically. But if they try to remake themselves, try to bring into being a Republican Leadership Council, so to speak, as David Brooks and William Kristol have argued, talking about big government conservatism, as Ross Douthat and Reihan Salam have talked about Sam's Club conservatism, then they begin to look suspiciously like moderate Democrats. And pundits on the right will start attacking them for being dime store New Dealers. At least that's the term Barry Goldwater and his allies used to criticize Dwight Eisenhower and his generation of moderate Republicans in the 1950s and early 1960s. So politically, I think conservative Republicans are in not such bad shape. Ideologically, they have a real problem. And so the prospects for the turning of this progressive moment into a progressive era might depend as much on the continuing unpopularity and confusion of the conservatives as on anything progressives like us do. As always in politics and sports, the best plan is to go up against an opponent who doesn't have one. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Ezra?
Well, thanks for having me in the book and on the panel. You know, it was funny doing the book a little bit because, like a lot of liberals, we ended up searching for progressive America in Western Europe, which I think happens a lot and maybe a bit too much. And I was thinking a lot about that when we sort of went through the election. And the day after, you had this sort of very resounding liberal win. You had over 50% for the first time for any Democrat in, over a couple decades. And the next morning we woke up and we were told we lived in a center-right country, which I found surprising, but so be it. And so I want to talk a bit today about why we're not searching for progressive America, but for progressive government. Because I think that there was something very basic that got misunderstood when people begin, A, comparing us to Western Europe, but B, trying to figure out where the center of this country actually lies. So I did at one point have a wonderful slide here called the centriest, rightiest country of them all. But that slide won't work. So we need to go out of this somehow and...
It's ungrammatical anyway.
Oh, well, that's fine. And go to another window where I can show a video from... Great. Where I can show a video made by the fine people here at Think Progress, which I think should help explain what we're dealing with a little bit. So let's just play that. If the lights could go down or the sound could go up, both of those would be good things. I don't think the sound's down on the YouTube. I never got to be in a band, so AV guy. I've always wanted to ask for more volume though. More cow.
Not center left, it's center right.
Well, that was going to be my question.
This country is more conservative than it was when we took over in 1994 after 2 years of calamitous democratic rule. It is a center-right country.
Keep in mind, we are a center-right nation. No Democrat since LBJ has won with more than 51% of the popular vote.
In a center-right country, I don't think the American people really want the liberal agenda. But they may get it anyway just because they're upset during the financial crisis.
He's just failing to nationalize the election between conservatives and liberal. America is a center-right country, and Reagan showed us that. George H.W. Bush showed us that in 1988 campaign.
We're a center-right country, and Senator McCain is a center-right presidential candidate. Senator Obama is way off on the far left.
Congress is going to be moved to the left, whereas the country is center-right, as you can tell by the fact Obama's been moving to the center as fast as he...
All right, we got a couple more minutes of that, but as you can see, we're decisively a center-right country, and so I think that should largely be proven at this point. How do I jump back into slideshow view here? All right, here? Okay. For somebody who mainly lives on his computer, I'm actually sort of bad with this sort of thing. Okay, so let's jump through here. All right. And David Sirota, who's a pundit who actually used to be part of the Center for American Progress, made a convenient graph of this trend. And these are center-right nation, the words and news stories from Google. And where that line goes up, that's November 4th, basically. So as soon as Obama's elected, we suddenly get a whole ton of, we're a center-right country. But the question becomes, what does center-right mean? Center-right as compared to what? So one sort of question is, what exactly is the center we're looking at? You occasionally hear that it's basically Western Europe, that we don't have quite the social democracy that they have out there that we saw when we went to the Netherlands. And as such, as compared to other industrialized nations, we are over to the right of them. That makes some amount of sense. You heard about presidential elections. One of our our fine pundits mentioned that no Democrat had won with more than 51% of the vote since LBJ. On the other hand, Democrats have won the popular vote in 4 out of the 5 last presidential elections. So that makes for a sort of odd. We may have been a center-right country once, but once I was 7, and I'm not anymore. These things change. Survey data. This is where you would expect to see it, right? If we were a center-right country, you'd expect to be able to create a sort of metric in which there are opinions you consider on the left, universal health care, and on the right, people can die in the gutters. And then people would be on either left or right side of that. But if you attempt to go through survey data, as many have shown before me, you find a pretty complicated picture. People are sort of left on health care, they're right on gay marriage, they're sometimes right on taxes or left on pensions. It's a complicated picture, and it wouldn't well lend itself to calling the country either center-right or center-left or really anything at all. People's ideologies are somewhat inchoate. And then, of course, I think you have the socialists that haunt our dreams and have since the 50s and 60s who, theoretically, we don't agree with them, and they are the left, the sort of the stereotype liberal, the California liberal, the Russian liberal. And as there's no sort of real constituency for that in this country, we are, again, presumed to be right. I think that's not completely correct. But what I do think does make sense is that in outcomes, we are a center-right country. I think that the reason there is some salience to that argument, the reason there's some resonance to it, is that people look at this country and they say, you know what, there are in fact a lot of things we don't have that other countries do and that the left has been fighting for many decades. Universal health care remains a sort of long-standing ambition, but not a concrete reality. Paid family leave. We are the only industrialized nation without paid vacation. Instead of paid family leave, Australia and us were the only nations without it. Now Australia has instituted it this year. We're the only industrialized nation without guaranteed paid vacation for workers. Obviously, gay marriage, cap and trade, Kyoto, international cooperation. We didn't pay our dues to the UN. There are ways in which we often do seem to be trending a bit right as compared to other nations of the world, and also as compared to what you would imagine the liberal agenda, had it been successful, would have created. And so the question then, if the liberal agenda has not been successful, is why? And an obvious, easy answer would be that people don't agree with the liberal agenda. And what I'm arguing to you today is that people actually give public opinion too much weight here. They are too likely and too quick to associate the outcomes of the legislative process with the opinions of the electorate. And I don't think you actually have a particularly good one-to-one between them. And so what I'd say is we don't have a center-right country, but we actually have a conservative governmental structure, conservative governmental institutions. There's a good book that just came out called The Liberal Hour, and it looks at the sort of this remarkable moment in the 60s when just an enormous amount of what we consider fundamental to the progressive architecture of the country now is created. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the Clean Air Act, and just sort of on and on and on. And they sort of ask the question, the authors, why did this happen? How did it happen? And there's a wonderful quote that they use to explain why it hasn't happened, rather than why it happened then, why it hasn't happened more often. And they write, periods of great policy upheaval are rarities in American history. The American system of governance is by nature conservative. It is a collection of traps and catches designed to hamper majorities, to slow the process of change, to favor the status quo. Most of the time, inertia is the most powerful force in government. Those who succeed at change have to succeed at dozens of potential veto points. Those who seek to prevent change usually have to succeed at only one. The one veto point, incidentally, is generally called the filibuster, but there are in fact more, and it's something that a lot of other countries don't have to deal with. And so I'd say again that what you have are center-right outcomes. And center-right in the sense not that they always favor the right side of the American political divide, but if you take conservative to equate with the status quo, with standing in the way of reform, then they are center-right in that sense, and this has at many times frustrated reformers of the right as well. I'd suggest that folks go back and look at George W. Bush in 2004, wins with more than 50% of the vote, speaks of a sort of almost cosmic mandate. I mean, you would have thought he was Galactus. This may not be the right audience for Marvel Comics jokes, come to think of it. And he comes in and he's got sort of a great plan, and the pundits, incidentally, people will think back, and maybe I should have gotten some examples, it really looked like he had the strength to do it. The left was very afraid of privatization. It seemed like a very distinct possibility. It not only fails, it fails catastrophically. And much like the right looks at the 1994 healthcare debacle and sort of pats itself on the back for superior political strategy and organizing, the left looks at 2005 and looks at what it did and looks at sort of a grand success in opposition. And it was really around that fight that the resurgence of the American progressive movement began, I would say. But on some level, both those things are true. The right really did fight viciously and effectively in 1994. The left really was unified in a way we hadn't often seen in 2005. But on a deeper level, I'd argue that both examples were in fact a victory for the essential obstructing institutions of American government. That the system did what it does best, which is repel change. And this happens either when you're trying to roll back advances or push them forward. Both essentially require legislation. Legislation is subject to numerous veto points, and so it's no easier, really, to vastly expand Medicare or vastly expand universal health care than to roll it back. And the right has not had much success cutting Medicare, cutting Social Security, cutting really anything or changing really anything than welfare. And so I would say that the question of whether we're center-right does not map easily onto whether we are center-Republican or center-Democrat. But it does map easily onto whether we are center-change or center-status quo. And I'd say we do certainly trend towards the latter. So are we a conservative country? Insofar as it means the status quo, then yes, the American government, not necessarily the people, but the government, the literal institutions of American governance, are conservative. They're hostile to reformers of both stripes, which and Republicans are often no more conservative than Democrats. So when asking where you find progressive America, I would argue that the question is not one of persuasion. Progressive America means an America with progressive policies. That would be, theoretically, the real place we would locate it. If you were looking for an America that one could usably define as progressive, then you wouldn't just look at the opinions. You wouldn't just look at the pundits. You would actually look at what does the built architecture of the country appear as. And what you would find is that you're not then looking for a search for agreement. There have been many times when there is at least superficial agreement on a particular policy priority, and it crashes on the shoals of the system, which means that what we are looking for is not a simple job of persuasion or framing or messaging, which was sort of a convenient fiction in 2004 with George Lakoff and sort of others of that ilk, that what needed to happen was simply better communication on the left side so more people agreed with us. That may be part of it, but it's not the full of it. The search for progressive America, I'd argue, is actually a search for translating progressive sentiment into actual legislation. And that's where the next couple of years are really going to see their test. It has been, I think, decisively proven, our friendly YouTube video aside, that America can certainly at times prove itself a center-left country in sentiment and in desire. But I think it's really an open question whether it can prove itself center-left in outcome. And that's going to be, I think, the real trick for reformers. And it's going to require that the movement that supports them, the sort of unified ideological movement Michael spoke eloquently of before, turns its attention to the problems of passing legislation rather than simply communicating ideas. And I'll leave it there.
Should I just, oh, okay.
I can just move.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, looks good. Let's watch the video again. Well, this is great. I am so happy that Michael asked me to put an article in this book, because not only can my mom find me on Amazon now, but I get to sit on panels and learn so much from my colleagues. This is really, really interesting. I really like all the presentations I've heard so far. Is there a problem?
Oh, while we're waiting, I'll just mention there are plenty of free American prospects in the back on your
There
way
you go.
out. Contractually, I have to let you know that.
All right, as long as he's advertising and I'm holding up the platform, which I got to work. This is the funnest thing I got to do, working for Obama, and there was a lot of fun things about working for Obama. But I got to spend my summer vacation. Yeah, it's called CAP. There it is. It's right there. It's this. That's it. Writing the Democratic platform, which was incredibly fun. And one of the great things about it was, in typical Obama style, even though we had only 5 weeks to write what's usually given 5 months, but because the primary was so delayed, we didn't get started until very close to the convention. That's when the platform is adopted. And in typical Obama fashion, we decided to open it up so that instead of this backroom deal making, we were going to have platform hearings all over the country. And so people were given about a week to sign up on the internet, and they had about a week to hold these platform hearings that were kind of like meetups. And 1,600 platform hearings happened all over the country. 30,000 people participated. It was truly incredible. And the ones that I went to were so encouraging in terms of where Ezra just left off, because, first of all, people were so engaged. You know, here was a chance not just to raise money, not just to knock on doors, but to actually talk about policy, which they were so excited about. But then at the end, people would say, well, how are we all going to stay in touch? You know, who's collecting our email addresses so that we can all stay in touch with each other, and so that when it comes time to pass health care reform, when the Harry and Louise ads start going, somebody can tell us what the true story is, and we can all tell each other and get organized and help Obama pass health care. And to me, that was just amazing, that you had this community building going on, and people wanted to sort of create institutions on the spot, and that they got that it wasn't going to be over the day they elected the president, that they were still going to have a responsibility. And one of the other things that struck me in those was when you talk about a basic understanding of what they wanted from the government. It was so clear, and so there was so much consensus. And so I just put this quote in here from it because I want somebody to read the platform. So, you know, this idea that there's a basic bargain between Americans and their government, but that it's not being met. And so we wrote, Americans reaffirmed our belief that this great nation can compete and succeed in the 21st century, but only if we take a new approach, innovative and faithful to the basic economic principles that look out for families in the new economy with health care, retirement security, and help, especially in bad times, investment in energy, education, infrastructure, science, a ladder of opportunity that will allow all Americans to take advantage of the opportunities of our new era. So there was just incredible consensus that we had a basic commitment, a basic bargain, and it wasn't being met, but we could do it, and it was absolutely necessary to do it. So what I wanted to talk about today was sort of the difference between our chronic problems and our acute problems, and that just as in the New Deal under FDR, he addressed both. He addressed the problem of the Great Depression and of unemployment, but he also addressed chronic problems that had been building, and in terms of the total change in the structure of the economy and people's lives, that New Deal isn't new anymore, and that if we want to make it new, we have to do some of that reforming that Ezra just told us is so hard to do. And in addition to all the problems that Ezra laid out in terms of how hard it is to reform, a big problem is just that the present tends to trump the future. And a lot of the reforms we need to make are really about investing in the future. So what do I mean by the chronic and acute? So in the 1930s, we had this transformative period where people had moved from the farm to the city, and they were now working in factories, and so they were suddenly, as opposed to dependent on this farm for income, and everybody was working, the whole family was working, suddenly there was one wage earner going to a factory. Secondly, they'd had an extended family network they could rely on. Now that was broken down as they moved into the city. And then because of public health improvements, life expectancy was up, so that's why you had all those newly old people. And the combination of those three things led to this problem of chronic economic insecurity, where because you were so dependent on that breadwinner, that one breadwinner working in that factory, you could really see ups and downs of a different sort. Obviously, there had been plenty on the farm, but this was a different sort. And the Social Security Act that finally got passed was designed to address exactly this. So you had a variety of things that were meant to smooth out the income stream, the cash, inflow to that family. And when you think about it, the Social Security Act really wasn't about addressing the immediate problems of the Great Depression. It was really about addressing this chronic problem. You had other programs, and culminating in World War II, that really were about getting the economy moving again, that were really about getting people employed. But these were really about dealing with this long-term transformative economic situation. So you had retirement benefits from the Social Security, individual and spousal benefits. You had help for widows and dependent children. You had income smoothing if there was a cyclical downturn in terms of unemployment insurance. And then eventually, this came later, if the breadwinner lost the ability to earn because of disability. So in all those different kinds of cases, if you had an interruption in your income, the Social Security Act was there to smooth it out. But it wasn't just, one of the things people mistake when they think back to the New Deal era was that it was about sort of enforced saving, that it was about every person being forced to save for their own catastrophe. And obviously it wasn't that. And some of this came out in the debate over privatizing Social Security, but some of it was left out. And the part that I think was left out, when people talked about how it was progressive. So progressive obviously meaning that if you're lower income, you get a little bit more out of Social Security than you pay in, and if you're higher income, you get a little bit less. But in addition to that, it's it's social in terms of the fact that it was always designed not just to help the single breadwinner, but his family. And so even today, 50% of people receiving Social Security benefits are a widow, a widower, a spouse or child of a worker or a disabled worker, rather than just the individual. Because you had that spousal benefit, that means that if you've been married for more than 10 years, the couple in retirement gets 150% of what the individual retiree would have earned. If the worker dies, there's the survivor's benefit, and so on. So it was always meant to be more than just for the individual, or even more than just progressive. It was always meant to help that entire family unit and the kid. Let's be specific. Get through those economic times. And then I'll just go through this really fast. This is just, we all know this by now by heart, but the workplace has dramatically changed since then. It used to work 40 hours a week, 40 years for one employer. There were strong unions. There was a family wage eventually. If you had a high school education, that was pretty much a ticket to middle-class life, and now that's all changed, and people are in these non-standard jobs. They change jobs every 5 years. They lack unions. They're competing with people around the world for wages and benefits, and it's almost a winner-take-all kind of society where you really need unique skills or assets. And so the economy has dramatically changed from when we put in place those New Deal policies, from sort of this big employer company-man relationship to a global free agent. And then the family has changed dramatically as well. And again, this is all stuff we know, but you went from a situation where you had 70% of families had a single breadwinner and a mom at home to the reverse. So now you have over 70% of families with children that are either headed by two working parents or a single parent that works. In fact, a third of children today are living with a single mother, a third. So dramatic change in terms of what's going on with the family since we put in place those programs. And that what that means is that New Deal system that was designed to smooth out your income in that old economy is just not new anymore. And so this is my second point, that the New Deal is no longer new. And what do I mean by that? So health insurance and pensions were set up to be delivered through the employer and through the tax code. So the tax preferences to create health insurance and pensions in this country were tax incentives that benefit you if you have a better job and if you're higher income. And that means that as people are changing jobs more often, as they're competing against people around the world, the very people who need that health care and those pensions are not getting them. And they're not getting the government benefits. So the way the government is structured is actually it's helping those who need the help the least. And Social Security, you would think, doesn't have that problem because it doesn't go through the tax code and it doesn't go through the employer. But in fact, it goes through the breadwinner. And so to the extent that you have single parents raising kids, to the extent that you have dual earner families, you're seeing that they're getting less generous benefits. So again, the economy already hits those people, and then the way the government program is structured, because it's structured with all the best intentions around the old family, around the old economy, winds up hurting those people who need the most help. And then unemployment insurance, you have a very similar situation. Again, completely different structure, but it's keyed to job attachment. And so that means you have to have worked a long time. It's higher the higher your income was. It's not there if you lose your job for family reasons. So again, the new family and the new economy, it helps those who need the least help. And so the consequences of the, I thought we had a different slide. Here we go. So what are the consequences of the outdated system? Because it's real, right? I mean, we're not just talking about, like, wouldn't it be nice if it were a little better? Wouldn't that help a couple more people? This fraying safety net is really hurting a lot of people all the time, and it's helping our most vulnerable. And the very reason that these programs were put in place to help our most vulnerable and the people who are most at risk of being out in the street, of not being able to succeed later in life, not getting a second chance. Those government programs are not there for them. And again, you all know these statistics, but I'm just trying to put it in a frame. The healthcare situation where half of personal bankruptcies are caused by medical bills. Only a third of unemployed workers collect unemployment benefits. The personal saving rate, so there's no cushion, is the lowest since the 40s. And then if you think about our future and, how are we helping those who are raising our kids, it's actually adding to the penalty that you pay for raising a child, because you're already obviously losing wages and benefits, but now you're losing your health and pension government subsidies, and you get a Social Security penalty as well because you've earned less. And obviously that hurts the future if people aren't, sooner or later you get what you pay for. And if we're not helping those who are caring for kids, we're going to see stats like this where 18% of our children are in poverty. So what would new look like? Sorry to go back to Europe, but other industrial countries have universal health care, progressive retirement systems with a minimum benefit guarantee, which means you don't just get what you earn, you get a minimum benefit to keep you out of poverty. And you get a credit towards retirement for time spent caring for kids, you get family allowances, you get paid parental leave, and you get a right to work. Am I over my time? Soon. Okay. I'm almost done, so it's perfect. So so the only thing I'll leave you with is, the obstacle. I was trying to sort of put it in positive that the present mustn't trump the future, but I think I feel, pretty nervous about whether or not we'll actually be able to reform this system. And it's for all the reasons that Ezra said, but also because those old people who were able to organize in the 1930s are doing pretty well. And it's the kids and the people who are taking care of them and the lower income folks who really need these kinds of reforms. And I'm not sure that they have the information they need, but I also don't know that they have the clout they need to get the kind of very, very difficult change that would be required to help address their chronic economic insecurity issues. And I think it's absolutely essential if we're not, the economic not only insecurity, but the economic inequality that we're seeing is just not American. It's not what we think of as America. And if we don't grapple with some of these changes, I think we're really going to see a very different kind of America. And the very, very bright light on this is obviously that the new incoming president understands all this and is and the effort that you're seeing on healthcare reform, I think, is going to, if there was one thing in all this that was the most important, it would obviously be the health insurance reform. And there's so much impetus behind it that could make a tremendous difference. So thank you very much.
Karen, and thanks to all of you. It was a necessary dose of realism there. I found quite insightful. I think there's a lot to chew over. We have a little bit of time left. I think I'm just going to go straight to audience questions since we have to wrap up around 2. So if you could please raise your hand. You'll get a microphone. If you could say your name, who you're with, and direct your question. And please try and keep it brief because we have other people who want to ask questions. And just one other... We're not going to get into should Obama pass EFCA or, very specific things about the Obama administration. That's not what this is about. So thank you. This gentleman right here.
My name is William Stokes. I'm with Afro-Americans Care. When I think of in search of a progressive America, I think of being in search of democracy in America. That is a government that's truly of, for, and by the people. What I mean by that is we're living in a society today where everyone has the same obligations and responsibilities, yet everyone doesn't receive the same benefits for their citizenship. And so what I guess I'm having a bit of confusion about what the panelists is considered to be progressive. Because, to me, progressive means how do we evolve a society? Okay, progressive to me means how do we evolve a society free of poverty, free of social economic inequality, competition in the workplace. Because any form of competition says that somebody has to lose for somebody to win. So I'm just saying that I need a clarity on how do we define progressive.
It's an excellent question. I think we can address it all three. Are we being progressive enough? Are we defining progressive in the right in the right manner and with the right set of issues. I don't know, Michael, you want to start off?
I hate to bite the hand that feeds me here, but I've always had a problem with that term myself, progressive, because I won't go into the history of it, but I'm more comfortable with liberal or radical, and because I think that there's differences there. Progressives tends to mix the two together, tends to mix some of the things you're talking about, sir, which sound more radical actually. A very different kind of system with liberal change, which is about reform within the basic structure of society as you have it. Basically. Are they going to have a fairer capitalist society or some other kind of society? The only thing that's on the agenda, I think, for good reasons actually, is a more liberal capitalist society. The socialist stuff didn't work out very well, but I do think that the issue of democracy is one that we didn't talk about, which is really important to focus on to a large extent. That's why I always talk about movements and how important they are to not carrying out change by themselves, but to pushing people in power to do things, and also to change public opinion. I think civil rights movement, didn't change the conditions for the majority of African Americans, at least not right at first. It took quite a while for that to begin to change economically, but I think it did begin to change public opinion about how black people were treated in America, and that is key. That's one example. So, you guys want
to? I largely agree with what you said.
Hi, Matt Brown from the Center for American Progress, but also the Progressive Governance Network. I think it's interesting that you look to Europe for definitions of what progressive means. Actually, when we're in Europe, we look to Scandinavia and to Canada. And interestingly, these are both regions of the world now that are run by what you would normally term centre-right governments. Stephen Harper in Canada, Sweden and Denmark also centre-right. But I think that points to the fact that it's right, that it's actually the policies that are institutionalized often in the countries that determine how progressive a country is. But what that also says to me is a second thing, that actually perhaps left and right aren't useful terms anymore for defining what is progressive or not progressive. I mean, I think certainly the majority of parties that would determine or define themselves as progressive in Europe are actually sort of centrist. They try and govern radically from the centre because they believe that a lot of the problems we face today aren't usefully resolved in a policy paradigm through the prism of left or right. And so my question to the panel, I suppose, is that with Obama there's been a lot of talk about bipartisan governance. Does that mean that he believes left and right are no longer useful guides to determining policies of a government?
You're looking at me. I won't pretend to speak for him, but I do think it's a really, I think if you listen to what we were all talking about, I think we were sort of talking about stasis or moving forward. We were talking about reform. And maybe that, I'm not going to say that that's better than left or right, but maybe that's useful. Like if you just take a look at the reality of what is needed, there's a common sense approach and an agreement, I think. And that's another way to talk about it. That instead of saying, are we moving left or right from where we are we moving forward with what people's needs are and what the vast majority of people, that 60% in the middle, actually think we need to do. And, when I think about when Tony Blair came in, running on the need to reform the health system before the middle class all left it, was that left, right, or just we've got to fix it. We've got to make it sensible so that it actually benefits the people it's there to benefit. So I think it's an interesting question.
I'll just add a point or two onto that if I could. First, I like your point, and it just made me think, and the Scandinavians look only to God, maybe. But
probably not.
But there's a concept in political science that's become in vogue recently. You used to have a lot of talk about political realignment, and you would think of FDR, or some people thought of Reagan, and then that got sort of really questioned by the empirics. It didn't really seem that there were political realignments where new coalitions emerged and endured. But what they do seem to think can happen is policy realignment, where in the actual, what you don't have coalitions endure, but you actually have certain ideas get passed by both sides for a period of 20 or 30 or 40 years at a time, which is how you get someone like Nixon passing the most aggressively environmental legislation that the country's ever seen. I mean, as a progressive in this era, to think that we have legislation where you can't build something if there's a snail is mind-boggling, but at some point it was passed by a Republican. And then he also wanted a healthcare system that was much more liberal than anything, say, Barack Obama is proposing now. And there was a policy realignment for that period. Similarly, Clinton emerged in a policy realignment of the other side and was passing the idea that it would be a Democrat to reform welfare towards workfare. Would have been surprising. I'm not passing judgment whether the policy was right or wrong, but you do seem to have that capacity. And so I don't know how that interacts with the question of whether or not left or right is useful, but the question of can you have new moments does seem to be the case. And so I would suggest that when you have the center-right on power in Canada and Scandinavia, that sort of works into the same issue there. The center just moves around whatever the consensus position is, a policy position. And at that point, left and right actually become less important than where that center is. So maybe one of the responses you could give is that left and right may not be terribly operative terms, but center sure is.
Let's move to the back, and then we'll come back forward in the back corner there.
Thanks. My name is Josh Ternoa. I'm with an organization called One. And it seems to me that in terms of foreign policy, one of those moments is actually happening in terms of aid for the developing world, especially with the recent passage of a bill called PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Relief for AIDS. And I wonder if you see any other moments like that in terms of policy where things are going to start to move through, where you see these alignments of policy.
Just to clarify, specific emerging policies that you think are going to signify a real progressive shift? Is that the realigning issues? Anything domestically or
Sure,
on the international front?
I think certainly domestically, the one thing that you can say with some certainty, and I wouldn't, my big issue is healthcare, but I think whether we get real healthcare reform remains an open question. You're going to have an infrastructure investment moment that we haven't seen since the 50s. And it's going to be huge. And I think one thing that's interesting, and you heard it when Obama was on Meet the Press this weekend, is that the incoming administration, I think, really gets the sort of generational nature of the opportunity. This isn't simply a stimulus bill. It's also a bill about what America looks like for the next 50 or 60 years. And that's a moment of sort of opportunity aligning with agenda. He did not come in for most of the primary campaign, certainly promising a giant infrastructure investment. This was just not something he ran on. But the moment has suddenly opened for a tremendous opportunity, and they would be extremely unwise, I think, not to take it. And I think that's being realized, or certainly the public statements suggest that. So that's where I look for the most radical change, because I think that, going off what Mike said, it can't currently be blocked.
What's on the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say the other thing is energy. You know, that you saw that moving even before, and there are plenty of Republicans who understand the need to do something about the climate and also about just embracing new technologies to release our dependence on fossil fuels and on foreign sources of oil. But obviously there are very different approaches, but I think there's a real consensus around doing something.
Once on this, just quickly, that the infrastructure debate has moved, I think, is Bill Kristol, in his column today in the New York Times, you know, some people probably read, said, "Oh, we're all for infrastructure, but we should spend it on the military because they really need it." But the idea that yes, government should be spending a lot of money on infrastructure is now consensus.
Let's get these last two right here, and we have to officially end the program at 2, but we can continue the discussion, and I think our authors have agreed to sign some books for a little while up front. So let's just get these two questions real quick, and then.
I'm a physician. I'm a visiting fellow here. And I'm particularly interested in healthcare.
What's your name?
Carolyn Poplin. I'm up in the visiting fellow's office. It seems to me there must be something different about our country because we're still trying to get universal health care when this is not rocket science. I mean, everyone else has it, and we're still groping around for a different American way to do it using the market. And I wonder, what is it about America that makes us unable to build on, you know, the foundations everywhere else? Is it because we have this thing about the market that we should always try the market first? Or is it our political structure that's not a parliamentary structure, and individuals can be highly influenced by small, wealthy corporate special interests, physicians, image manufacturers, stuff like that. I also think part of the thing about center-right, or part of the acknowledgement that the country is, at least in the center, is that people feel so uncomfortable using the word liberal.
Okay,
I mean,
thank
the
you.
okay.
Thank you. Let's get this question, then we'll answer. We'll find out what that was. So we have something on healthcare. We'll get back to you. Let's just.
My name is Bill Taylor. I'm a civil rights lawyer. And picking up from Karen's remarks, I guess I want to put a broad question in, and that is, what is the motive power for a new progressive movement or a renewed progressive movement, and what are its priorities? Professor Kazin said we have talked about the educated classes. Well, the educated classes are larger in number than they were in the last three eras. They are more educated. Whether they're better educated is a question you can ask. They are wealthier. And all of those things might lead, and I think have led, to a certain distancing between that class and the people who fought for labor unions and who fought for civil rights and for other things. So I guess I'm wondering where do we go? There are lots of issues, and maybe health care is an issue that brings people together. But if you think that the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots is a major issue in this society, what's the likelihood that will be confronted by the educated classes of people who have some clout?
It's a good question. There was a contest in the 1924 edition of The Nation that somebody put up a contest for a lock of some senator's hair if somebody could define what is progressivism, and he ended the challenge by saying, every single movement has a particular point of view and a program that illustrates that. So, what is the motive of the new one, Michael? And then we'll finish on the healthcare discussion. Would be great.
Yeah, it's a huge question. I think that one of the problems is that there are, policy agendas and there are cultural agendas, and they don't always mix. And despite the fact that a lot of people who disagree on some of the cultural agendas all voted for Obama, we know from the split Proposition 8, in California, for example, that there's a lot of suspicion, not just on people's religious cultural backgrounds, but also people who are more educated and think they're more educated, think they have something to teach people who are less educated, especially those who are actually sometimes work for the more educated in their homes and gardens and places like that. That there's this lingering suspicion, I think, across class lines, which gets papered over, I think, on the broad left, perhaps more than it should. I think that on the one hand, the technology for a cross-class large movement is there, as we know, with the internet, and most people in society have cell phones. I mean, communication is not a problem. The problem, to return to what I said in the beginning, I think, is sort of what is the civic moralism, of progressives? What are the 2 or 3 things that we want to tell Americans that we care most about, that a decent society cannot live without? Healthcare, of course, but the healthcare is a program. Healthcare is not, in the end, an end. And I think the vision thing is something that we still lack. Now, maybe that's just a matter of you have to do more politics. You have to have people you like in power for longer, and you see. Once you act, then you see, as Napoleon said. But I think that's still a problem, and that was not so much a problem in the 30s or even in the 60s in a sense, because there was still this, as I said before, this sort of historic left idealism, which, with the failure of socialism, is no longer, can be taken for granted anymore.
Karen and Ezra, healthcare.
Oh, can I address Bill's question? Because I don't actually have an answer, but it's got me thinking. And from what obviously speaks to Michael, who knows an awful lot more than I do, but what I remember of the little bit I've read about FDR is that he kept trying new stuff, and didn't necessarily know where he was going to come out. And so, maybe it's the moment we're in with all the fear everyone has of how far we're going to fall that's causing people to act first on the stimulus, but let's turn the stimulus into long-run investment. And I think there's a backlog of priorities that, I think we'll turn to and experiment with. But I guess what I was thinking about when I was putting this presentation together a little bit is that that if you had to focus on one set of priorities, it would be who really needs government, and that would be the most vulnerable kids. They're the ones who can't take care of themselves, and so you don't want to be penalizing them or penalizing the people who care for them, and those people are very vulnerable in this economy, and we don't really have programs to take care of them. So yeah, would healthcare help them? Probably more than anything else, yes. But that's where I'm a little bit focused, and obviously the issue that your expertise is in education. We can't leave that out, and making sure that everyone gets access to a quality education is not going to happen by waving a magic wand.
Ezra, you get the last word on healthcare for us here.
Well, it's just because nobody else wants it. Well, to take a page out of the Nation's book, if anybody can actually answer for me definitively why we don't have universal health care, I will give them a lock of my hair. But barring that, I mean, I can give you 20 answers and refer you to 6 books, and nobody really knows. The relevant point, I think, is that we don't have it, and we have to figure out it will not be blocked for the reason it was blocked in 1942. I mean, Karen had much on keeping the present from trumping the future. We also have to keep the past from trumping the future, and the present for that matter. I mean, this is a town psychically scarred from 1994. The one thing about including 672,000 healthcare wonks in building your plan is that when it fails, they all feel personally burned, and they're all terrified of ever stepping back into the bad room where the horrible thing happened. And it's a real problem. It's a sort of poverty of imagination and ambition, and because there's a surfeit of fear. And which is not to say that this is easier, that it'll happen. I think the odds that we rack up an 8th failure are not trivial. And I think possibly I wouldn't even bet against them. But the question of what will destroy it this time will inevitably be a different question than what did it last time. It's sort of like what you're hearing with the financial crisis, that you always have bubbles. But if you're going to protect against the next one, you can't do it by legislating against this one. You have to figure out what the sort of relevant sources of opposition will be. And I just name one thing here that I think is important. People always talk about Harry and Louise. They always talk about the opposition of insurers. 1994, there was not this thing called managed care. When people talk about choice in healthcare, in 1994, you had it. You had what we know of as traditional insurance, and you chose your doctor, and you chose where you went, and off you went. And when Harry and Louise sat at their kitchen table and said, my God, if this goes through, we'll have this horrible dystopia where you can't go to a doctor outside your city, and you have to look through a giant book compiled by bureaucrats to figure out who will get paid for. And people might deny you coverage for various things that your doctor thinks you need. That sounded very alien, and suddenly it became everybody's reality. Which is not to say that healthcare reform will work this time, but it isn't going to be because people are so deeply sympathetic to the modern insurance product. There will be another reason, and so you got to figure out what that reason is and diffuse it. But I don't think it's very profitable to look back for lessons, but not to imagine past as prologue.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming today and for your questions. The holidays are coming up. We're selling books, so please grab one for a loved one or friend, and thanks to our panelists. And they'll be up here for a few minutes to sign some books.